HIV and AIDS and the stigma around it. The Prime Minister's been talking about it, and she's saying that this stigma is, an extraordinary thing to have in this day and age, considering the progress that has been made in the treatment and the prevention of HIV and AIDS. The shame and the taboo of it hasn't gone away.
There are currently more than 100,000 people in the UK living with HIV, according to the latest figures from Public Health England. Around 1 in 7 are undiagnosed. Since 2006, there's been a 70% increase in the number of people receiving treatment in the UK. And that number is rising. But every charity we've spoken to working in this field has told us that the shame and stigma surrounding HIV continues to exist. And we want to hear from you. Why do you think it is that social attitudes are failing to keep up with medical progress? And let's make it more personal. How would you react if you discovered a work colleague or a teacher at your kid's school was HIV positive? How would you react to that? Because, of course, perhaps you'd just like to say outwardly, I would never discriminate against anyone. I understand, of course, now that living with HIV is something, if you are taking your antiretrovirals, that you will be able to live a fairly normal life living with HIV. And some people compare it to, say, something like living with a condition such as diabetes. You can live with it through medication. You can manage it, is the word that Sarah rightly used. But what about the stigma? And if you are someone who is HIV positive, then how do you live your life in the workplace with your colleagues? Of course, it's none of their business, your health considerations, and you don't have to declare it.
Unless you're a doctor, is it?
Exactly. In certain jobs, you don't have to. But then if you are living with this, you're listening now to 5 Live, then what's it like to live with HIV? Because you're worried perhaps that your work colleagues will find out and then that they will discriminate against you. Because as the Prime Minister has pointed out, the discrimination, and as Sarah just said, the stigma connected to being HIV positive has not gone away. And in fact, while these medical processes and progress has gone at a pace, attitudes have not. And in fact, if you're as old as I am, you'll remember those adverts in the 80s of crumbling icebergs and all these kinds of things.
But that was the last time that most of us ever really paid attention properly.
Yeah, there was a major public health campaign about raising awareness. And if the numbers are going up, then chances are that somewhere within your sphere of friends, colleagues, acquaintances, there may well be someone. If there's over 107,000, according to figures from 2013 from Public Health England. But the numbers, as I said, are going up. So get in contact with us. There's ways of doing that. 0500 909 693 or text 85058. How would you react if you discovered that a colleague of yours, a friend of yours, was HIV positive? How would you change your behaviours? If you are HIV positive, have you seen behaviours change in your family, in your social circle, once it came out in the open? Just tell us what you think.
We've got lots and lots of great people for you to talk to and listen to today. We've got Deborah Gold, who's Chief Executive of the National AIDS Trust. And that's why Theresa May has actually been speaking about this. She's one of a number of politicians who've made speeches for the National AIDS Trust ahead of Thursday, because Thursday is World AIDS Day. So Deborah's with us. Anne Aslett is the Executive Director of the Elton John AIDS Foundation, EJAF for short, and that funds frontline programmes to help those living with AIDS. Well, Deborah, thanks so much for being with us. Theresa May has recorded this speech for your charity. Let's have a listen to it. This is the first time that these comments have been broadcast on radio.
As Prime Minister, I am proud to wear a red ribbon on World AIDS Day to show my support for people living with HIV in the UK and all across the world. I am proud too of the role that the UK has played in driving advances in the treatment and prevention of HIV, including, of course, through the brilliant care and support of our NHS, which makes such a difference in the lives of people living with HIV. But for all the progress in treatment and prevention, public attitudes have not progressed as far or as fast. The latest UK HIV Stigma Index found that almost 1 in 5 respondents living with HIV in the UK have had suicidal thoughts in the past 12 months, while around half reported feelings such as shame, guilt and low self-esteem in relation to their HIV status. This stigma is an unacceptable stain on our society, and we have to wipe it out. Stigma is not just profoundly wrong, it also prevents many of those affected from accessing the testing, treatment and support that they need. Today, around 2 in 5 people are diagnosed late, after the point at which treatment should have begun, with a significant impact on their long-term prognosis. Tackling stigma is one of the ways that we can change this. So I'm proud to support this year's campaign. HIV stigma is not retro, just wrong. I urge you to join me in taking a stand and leaving this stigma where it belongs, in the past.
The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn said World AIDS Day was vital to help change social attitudes towards people with HIV.
World AIDS Day is a chance to reflect on how far we've come, but also how far we've still to go when it comes to our response to HIV in this country. There are over 100,000 people living with HIV in Britain. The National Health Service provides what is amongst the best treatment and care in the world. Our health services perform extremely well against the United Nations targets and making sure that people diagnosed with HIV in Britain benefit from treatment available. Yet, while medical advances continue, social attitudes remain stuck in the past. HIV stigma is a daily reality and is experienced in situations where people should feel supported and valued, at work, in education, and when accessing services.
And that was the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Well, Deborah, strong stuff there from both of the politicians. An awful lot still to do to stamp out that shame and stigma surrounding HIV. And I mean, if you've got both of them to contribute to this, it must be quite a significant enough issue for them to say, yeah, we'll put everything aside and we'll both be part of this video.
Hi, absolutely. Hi. And we're so grateful that they and Tim Farron and Nicola Sturgeon, who also made videos, kind of recognised how important this is to draw attention to. There are lots of issues for people living with HIV, and people at risk of HIV, but the impact of stigma is really one of the biggest barriers, both to people living with HIV, living good, happy lives, and people at risk of HIV accessing the testing and the treatment that they need in a timely fashion to make sure that they have the best life chances after they're diagnosed and to make sure that they aren't unknowingly passing HIV on.
Deborah, it's a difficult, squaring that circle, because on one hand, we have to alert the public to the fact that the numbers are going in the wrong direction. The numbers are going up. But also, which could, of course, create some kind of overreaction in people. But then on the other hand, we have to assure the public that medical advances are such that this isn't the condition that we thought it was in the 80s. And it's difficult to balance that, isn't it?
That's really true, and getting that balance right is one of the things around tackling stigma properly, and that's why that political leadership that's been shown in the videos needs to kind of move into action. Tackling stigma is a complex process, and it's about really understanding why it's happening, where it's happening, in what different contexts, so that we can find the way to really engage with and talk to people about why they have those attitudes, because that's how we know that attitudes change, and that takes time and effort, but it also takes opportunities like World AIDS Day, where we have the chance to kind of draw attention once a year to something which is kind of under-recognised as a problem, and try to get people involved in taking responsibility themselves for thinking about who they know, how they act and how they can make a difference. And World AIDS Day really gives people a range of ways to be able to do that.
Well, we've got Valerie Delpeche with us as well, who's lead for HIV surveillance at Public Health England. Afternoon to you, Valerie.
Good afternoon.
And we can also speak to Andy Evans, who lives with HIV and is a haemophiliac. He contracted it through a contaminated blood supply. Afternoon to you, Andy.
Good afternoon.
Andy, let's just hear about it from the horse's mouth, as it were, then first, before we go much further with this. What is it like to feel stigmatised because you have HIV?
It's different to how it used to be.
I've been quite lucky because I've been brought into this through contaminated blood. I was very young when I contracted HIV. I was 5 years old. It was right at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, and so I was very shielded in the early years by my parents. We didn't speak about it for a long, long time.
Were the schools told, Andy, that you attended?
Yeah, in my high school was told that I was HIV positive, so that they could protect the other children in the event that I were to cut myself, or there would be some sort of blood-to-blood contact. They felt they needed to know, and actually the school was at the time quite good, and they kept it under wraps for us until it came time for me to leave school because of ill health. And then I later found out that they'd made an announcement, because I was close to death at that time, that I was dying of HIV and AIDS, and so that everybody in the school year found out that way. And obviously it was not really a realistic possibility for me to go back to school after that.
My gosh, when you were at school and you knew that the school knew, how much fear did you feel, Andy, that it would get out while you were at school?
Well, there was a lot. I'd been around in the time of the falling headstones and the crumbling icebergs, and I'd known of other people who were older than me when they contracted HIV through similar means, having been targeted with bricks through the window, with AIDS scum being painted on their houses in bright red paint, having their tyres slashed, because you get to know people when you're in the same sort of situation as them. So even at a young age, I was aware that these things were happening. And so, of course, putting it into a microcosm like a school, where you've got kids who don't really, they're not mature enough to be able to handle the information, really, that there's somebody with such a deadly virus and with such a stigma attached to it, with such a danger attached to it at that time. The thought of that getting out was terrifying.
Mm-hmm. So what you experience now, how has it changed? Because the National AIDS Trust is saying, we've just heard from the Prime Minister saying that the medical side of things has progressed significantly, but our attitudes are still way back in the early 80s. Do you think that's true?
I think to some extent it is, yeah. I was very open about my status for a good many years. I was given great opportunities to be able to tell my story through the media, with foundations like the Elton John AIDS Foundation and through the Haemophilia Society and other organisations. And while I was on my own, that was great, and I could take care of myself. And all was fine. But I've since, luckily, and I feel very lucky for this, been able to get married and have kids. And that changes everything a great deal, because all of a sudden you're not just protecting yourself anymore. You've got people that you love in the firing line. And we live in a small village. It's not easy to hide from this sort of thing. So, you don't... For example, there was somebody in our village with cancer, horrible, terrible breast cancer a couple of years ago. And they, of course, were able to tell people what was going on. It was fairly obvious, obviously, the hair loss, the signs of cancer. Everybody knew what was going on. Everybody was rallying around, being very supportive, which was absolutely right. And I was as well. I helped alongside them. But when it comes down to something like AIDS, that's unheard of. You don't tell people in a small community. You don't look for support from your neighbours. You look for support on the internet. You look for support through people who are going through the same thing as you, but you don't let it out publicly. And that's the difference when it comes to AIDS.
We have a caller, Chris, on the line. Just before we go to Chris, Deborah, just listening to Andy say about, daubing graffiti on walls and slashing tyres, that doesn't happen anymore, does it?
We've definitely moved on to some extent, but it does happen to a small proportion of people living with HIV, and it happens often enough that it also creates fear in many people who are living with HIV, and it means that people have a barrier and they don't feel confident about being open about their status because they can't be sure about what the reaction is going to be, and that stigma that they're experiencing can often intersect with other types of stigma as well, like homophobia and racism for some of those communities who are disproportionately impacted by HIV. And taking those things together, they really can mean both that people experience, as you said at the top of the programme, kind of feelings of shame and kind of fear, but also that they have real experiences of stigma themselves, or they know people who have experienced things. Yeah. And that's enough to kind of create that barrier.
And, it's enough of a stigma to not be able to say, excuse me, like Andy was saying there, like you would if you had cancer. I've got cancer, and everybody will feel sorry for you straight away. That in itself is a massive thing.
Absolutely. And we at NAT, every 4 years or so, we get Ipsos Mori to do some polling around people's attitudes to HIV and their knowledge of it. And one of the questions that we ask is around whether or not you would have the same level of sympathy for somebody who had HIV as somebody who has cancer. And although definitely over the kind of 20 years that we've been doing the polling, we've seen an improvement in those numbers, there's still a proportion of people who say no, wouldn't feel the same about somebody with HIV as with cancer. And those are the attitudes that we need to challenge.
Anne Asler is with us, the Executive Director of the Elton John AIDS Foundation, and good afternoon to you. The foundation was set up back in 92. Now, as we've been discussing, Anne, medicine has come a long way. It clearly is the case that social attitudes haven't necessarily kept up with that. Why do you think that is?
I think a big part of the reason is lack of role models, which is why it's so important that the National AIDS Trust is doing this campaign this year. I mean, what we know is when the foundation was first set up in the States originally, Ronald Reagan, who was president at the time, wouldn't even mention AIDS on air. And so automatically it has this sense that this is something taboo, this is something that you really shouldn't say out loud. So it's incredibly important, a bit like your news piece about abuse in football, it's incredibly important that brave people come forward and that public figures come forward. We work in 23 different countries, and in every country where we're seeing huge advances, political leaders saying that this is a problem and admitting that this shouldn't be discriminated against makes an enormous difference. And everywhere where they don't, we have a greater problem. I think the other issue as well is stigma from people who provide services. We know that a lot of doctors are very nervous to raise the issue of an HIV test with people, despite the fact that 17% of people in the UK are undiagnosed and don't know they're infected, because they feel that somehow that's a judgment. And maybe that goes right back to the days when, the AIDS epidemic was a gay epidemic. And so there's, as Deborah says, there's a sort of homophobia in there, but they just don't like to ask. And
thank you. We'll come back to you in a little while. We have 0500 909 693. That is the number. Now, we understand, of course, this is a very, very sensitive issue. So if you wish to remain anonymous, you can text us on 85058. If this is something that you are living with, and you're living with the stigma and discrimination, we heard Andy describe how it was, what he saw in the 80s, where people were slashing people's tyres and daubing, graffiti on people's houses. Now, hopefully we've moved on from that, but there is still huge amounts of discrimination and stigma against people who are living with HIV. And I just ask you, how would you react if you found that a friend or a colleague had HIV? Get in contact with us.
Somebody's texted us to say I wouldn't be freaked out by a friend being HIV positive. It hasn't happened yet, or at least I haven't been told. But I do have an issue with NHS cash going to preventative drugs. Use a condom. Before anyone accuses me of being anti-gay, I buried a gay friend not long ago, and I have the same problem with fertility treatment. Adopt or save up and go private. We're talking about HIV and AIDS and the stigma that still surrounds it all these years later, despite the amazing progress that we've made on the medical side of things. I've got Valerie Duplessis to talk to next, who's lead for HIV surveillance at Public Health England. Valerie, you've been observing HIV infections in the UK for the past 7 years. What can you say about the changes that you've seen?
Good afternoon. Thanks for the opportunity. So what we're seeing in the UK are numbers of people living with HIV increasing year on year. But I'd like to say that's actually potentially good. It actually also means that we're treating individuals and people are on life-saving drugs. And so the numbers of people living with HIV is only going to go up if we make sure that people don't die of HIV. So that's potentially good news. However, each year we're still seeing large numbers, over 6,000 for the last few years, of people who were newly diagnosed with HIV. Most of them have acquired their infection in the UK. So that is of concern, and certainly given that we have so many tools and understanding of how to prevent HIV, it is really still a situation that we should do much better of in the UK. I completely agree that with the previous speakers and also with Andy, that stigma is still a very powerful reason for why people don't come forward and get tested, for instance. And that's something around World AIDS Day and our testing week that we try and promote testing.
Good. Well, that's something that one of our texters, Will in Dumfries, is asking about. He says, you mentioned testing. Do doctors screen for HIV when they do blood tests for cholesterol, etc.? I've never gone for a test and wondered if the only way of knowing you're infected is a dedicated test.
So there are more and more easier ways to get tested for HIV these days, which is good news because the technologies have also advanced. So certainly going to a local doctor and asking for a HIV test is something anybody can do at any time.
And will it happen in the surgery, or you have to go into a clinic, outpatient clinic? Or?
That will depend on the setup of that surgery. It may happen if they take blood directly. They may have some point of care tests which can be done immediately as well. So it'll depend a little bit on the setup. There are also a whole range of new ways you can get tested by applying for a test on the internet and getting a sample which you take at home, and then you can take that sample gets sent to a laboratory, and that's called home sampling. You can also buy a test directly from a pharmacy and do a test at home. So there are many, many ways, and certainly we're promoting a range of ways that people know their status, because at the end of the day, the majority of people who know their status are able to look after their health and also ensure that by being on treatment, they are preventing onward transmission to others, because we know, particularly over the last few years, the evidence has been very, very strong that treatment is not only life-saving, but it actually prevents transmission. So it's quite critical, and the majority of people who are passing on their infection are actually those who are not aware of their HIV status.
0500 909 693, that is the phone number if this is something that you are living with and you're concerned about the possible discrimination you could face if the world was to know that you were HIV positive. Perhaps this is something that you've been through. We spoke to Andy earlier on, who went through this throughout the 80s, being someone who was 5 years old when he, through a blood transfusion, became HIV positive and had to go through his entire schooling life with this and the fear associated with it. But as has been pointed out by numerous people here today, there's still a stigma, there's still a discrimination.
Check this out, this text that's just gone in from Joe. We're going to give him a ring, but he said, I'm struggling with this issue, as I would be considered the most liberal of lefties when it comes to acceptance of any other issue, but I can't get my head around being okay with regular contact with someone who is HIV positive. Joe, we'll be giving you a ring. Hopefully you'll come on and we'll have a bit more of a chat and explain how you're feeling.
Yeah.
But Andy, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I'm shaking my head here in the studio looking at everyone that's here. But you know, in a way, it's kind of understandable. It's still a filthy disease. It's akin to leprosy back in the Dark Ages. You know, it's still got that aura about it. It hasn't gone away. It certainly hasn't gone away. I mean, from my perspective, being involved with the haemophilia and the contaminated blood background to my story, it's been a huge struggle trying to get some sort of resolution to that, just because people are afraid to come forward. Just like with the football abuse scandal, people do not want to be known to have experience of this, and so they don't come forward, they don't tell their stories, and so it remains unrecognised. And 30 years later, you know, here we are. with it still unresolved. So that's, yet another example of the stigma around.
Well, let's speak to Chris, who's called in from South London. As I said, the number is 0500 909 693, or you can send us a text like Joe did, the one that Sarah just read out, on 85058. Chris, good afternoon. Thank you for reaching out to us here on 5 Live, my friend.
That's right.
Now, you were late diagnosed. How old were you?
I was 51.
51, okay.
Yeah, and my story is, I was actually reading a book earlier on today about looking at the stigma about when the HIV first came out in the 80s, and I didn't realise how much venom and bile there was around then, and the sort of 80% of people thought at some point they thought that homosexuality should be made illegal. 51% thought that in the mid 80s, and the survey said how dreadful it all was, and I think from that point of view, I think probably I was sort of put my head in the sand, and and I think I just sort of carried on like that, and sort of it couldn't happen to me, and then I was away with my partner at his mother's, and suddenly on Christmas night I felt very ill. I had pneumonia, PCP as it was, and and when I went to the A&E, the doctor there said, "Have you had an HIV test?" And I went, "No." And as soon as he said that, I knew I'd had lots of issues coming up to that point. This is what it was, and I was sort of freaked out about it.
Did you think, Chris, because of course, to many people ages ago, it was as if it was a death sentence, wasn't it?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I remember watching all the adverts with the tombstones falling, and just thought, and I was in a sort of a secure relationship then. I was very young, but I was just thought, oh my God. And then I think perhaps because it went off the radar screens, it did with me too. And and I just thought,
with all of us, I think.
Yes, and I think, in my perspective, I also suffer from bipolar disorder, which is another stigma that you walk around with. And I think that the sort of, I think for me, I just put my head in the sand and thought, oh, well, no. And I thought, well, I'm not particularly promiscuous, so therefore, it won't happen to me, which is a ridiculous thing. But I think when I woke up in the hospital bed in Liverpool, I went to Liverpool then, and hospital, and I woke up and I just thought, how stupid am I? I just thought, why have I been doing this? Because obviously, I've been living with this chronic fatigue that's going on and on and on, having various illnesses I couldn't shake off. And I just thought, had I have done this, 10, 15 years ago,
so is that
my
how
life
many
wouldn't have
years?
changed.
Chris, how many years you think you were living with HIV?
Yes, because the doctor said to me, it's been in your bloodstream for an awful long time. And I just thought, I'd had night sweats going back years. And apparently when you get it firstly, the body immune system sort of reacts to it. And then for a long period of time, it sort of deals with it. And there comes a point, it differs from different people, when finally your system can't do it any longer, and then you get sick. And that's basically how it happened to me. Because for some people, as I say, I just struggled with it and thought, oh, well, that's fine. And interestingly, I just went in for a check, and they showed me, I looked at pictures of myself 2, 3, 4 years ago, and look at myself now and think, my God, is that what I look like? It was just quite scary.
Chris, do you think in that time you may have passed on HIV to somebody else?
I don't know, to be honest with that.
Is it something you've thought about?
I have thought about it, but I'm not. I don't know to answer that question because I think because my contact was almost nil for a long time. I just didn't do anything, but I know towards the end that I did, and so yes, I probably did, and that was to my shame, really, because I didn't know at that point. But it was just something
it's
that
not your shame. You didn't know.
No, I didn't know. But I think I was very foolish, really. I think that's the thing that I feel stupid about it. I think another thing to say is that, as I said in my text message, that the stigma is within your own community. The stigma within the gay community is still quite big, and I suspect that's why people in the community don't want to take tests necessarily, because the reaction they're going to get within dating sites saying we want clean people, i.e. HIV is dirty, those sorts of things. That sort of attitude will have a bearing on people and what they do.
I tell you what, Chris, thank you so much for being so brave and giving us a call. Thank you.
Do you mind staying with us for a little bit, though? Because we want to carry on the discussion. Yeah. It's very interesting that you're being here with it.
Yeah, okay.
Anne, you were nodding your head when Chris was describing the stigma that exists within the gay community.
Yeah, I think there is still a stigma. There's two things going on. I think with with younger generation gay men who don't really see HIV as a risk.
Right, yeah.
They're, that's for old gay men. That's for and there's a sort of sense that this is rather.
Is this a generational thing?
Yeah,
is it,
you belong to that old generation of gay men who all got HIV.
Sorry, can I just make a distinction? Is that because they now know that the medical advances mean that it isn't a death sentence as it was regarded in the 80s? Or is it because they just don't think that it's a thing that they need to worry about?
I think they just don't think that it's a thing.
Wow.
I think there are just other things going on in their lives and they don't necessarily think that it's a thing. And that's obviously very dangerous.
We've just had a text from a GP, actually, Karen, who said, I'm a GP. Please be aware that HIV testing is not routinely done with requests for a health screening. We do cholesterol and glucose, but you have to request HIV tests separately. This is not a problem, but don't assume it is done automatically. Chris, how was it for you in the workplace then?
Well, I mean, to be honest, it was obviously very, very towards the end of my career. I mean, I took a voluntary exit just a few months ago, and part of the reason I took that was because my health was not as good as it could have been, and I had other opportunities too. But I mean, I obviously my boss was very. I lay in the hospital bed and told her that what was happening to me, and she was very good about it. And so I mean, I didn't actually come out until it's funny. I was doing an article to do with disability, and I put this bit in this article that I did, and then I was talking to someone that said, "Well, this is about disability, this bipolar, not HIV." So, and I thought, well, I'll take it out then because it might just look odd. But in a way, I was thinking, well, it's a good thing to do to see how people react to it. I mean, I did tell a small number of people before I left, and I was quite comfortable with that. But I think if I'd stayed, I think I would have come out and told everybody. I mean, I was fortunate, as I said in my text, that I was a member of the LGBT group at the department that I worked in, and we managed to get the World AIDS Day flag flying over our building last year and again this year. And I'm very proud of that. And I think that, the fact that the people's perceptions are, I think perhaps in the workplace where I worked, was coming on stream, people were looking more favourably at it. But, I think I think I'm probably different. So I'm happy to put my hand up and say, this is who I am, because that's the sort of person I am, because that's the confidence that I have. But I think for many people, it's a different story. And I think that I've just been, I think that's been taking me a long road to get to a point where I'm happy with what's going on. But I do agree with the visibility angle. I think that, unfortunately, all these campaigns have all finished now, and people just don't see it as an issue. Younger people don't see it.
As Anne just said, very, very clearly. Yeah, Chris,
I think that's right.
Chris, thank you very much indeed for taking time to speak to us and be so honest with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a few facts that we've got from the National AIDS Trust today and from Public Health England. So 2015, 1.1 million people died from AIDS-related causes worldwide. That's compared to 2 million in 2005. That's pretty staggering. So it's almost halved in 10 years. 95% of people living with HIV in the UK have acquired HIV through sex without a condom. About 2/3 of people receiving HIV specialist care in 2015 here were men, and that's just over 61,000. A third were women, just over 27,500 people. And this is very interesting. Of those receiving HIV care in 2015, 48% were exposed through sex between a man and a woman, and 47% were exposed through sex between men.
Lots of texts coming in, as you can imagine. Ian from Birmingham said, how many of the 6,000 new cases diagnosed each year are people who contracted HIV in the UK? Ian then goes on to say, I'm sure you won't ask this question, so I can't believe what the subtext of that question is. Perhaps you could illuminate me as to what the subtext of that is. But if someone wants to answer that question, do we have any, Valerie, do we have any information as to how many foreigners are bringing HIV into this country?
So definitely what we do each year is we ask a number of questions, and just to be clear, when people are diagnosed, it doesn't mean that they are infected that year. They may, just like Chris talked about, may have had the virus many years. And so when people come to the UK, they may have actually acquired their infection prior to coming to the UK. What we're seeing is those numbers of individuals from abroad are actually on the decline, and the majority of infections now are actually from people living in the UK who've acquired their infection in the UK is the answer to that question.
Ian, that answers your question.
And importantly, however, too many people, as Chris explained for his personal condition, have, when diagnosed, are presenting too late. In other words, they are presenting with advanced infection, and that means that they may be hospitalised and have a much greater chance of not doing so well, with a 10 times higher chance of dying of the virus if you're presenting late in that year of diagnosis. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're, diagnosed promptly, you have a normal lifespan. So that's critical.
Well, we've just been talking about some of the figures around people that are living with HIV and AIDS here in the UK, but in Africa, it is the number one cause of death among teenagers and the second biggest cause of death around the world. A recent study by the UN revealed that in South Africa in 2015, around 7,500 young women were infected with HIV every week. Well, Lois is a young woman who lives in Zimbabwe. She is HIV positive and has faced a great deal of stigma through her life. She played a crucial role in moderating a session at the International AIDS Conference in Durban earlier this year. That was with Prince Harry and Sir Elton John. Lois, thank you so much for being with us on the programme. You lost both your parents and your brother at 9 years old. Is that right?
Thank you so much for having me on the call, yes.
And when you were 13, you were tested positive for HIV, is that right?
Yes, when I was 12.
Right. And what happened after that? How did people treat you, Lois?
So what happened is that I lost both my mother and my younger brother in the same week due to AIDS and tuberculosis. And it was really a depressing moment for me as I had lost the people who were close to my heart. Mm-hmm. And before my mother and my younger brother had passed away, I had already lost my father due to a car accident. So from there, I started changing households of my paternal relatives for my father's side. And it was really a period where I didn't really understand the changing of households. It made me feel like I was not worthy. And then in 2004, that's when I started to get really sick. I lost all my weight and I had to stop school for some months because of my sickness. And when I went to the clinic, I was tested for HIV, and I was told that I got HIV and tuberculosis. It made me feel really depressed. I cried and I thought I was going to die, and that was the end of me. But I'm alive, and I am a confident young woman who looks so beautiful, and I'm very strong. So then, at a period of time in 2010, I faced a lot of emotional, physical abuse from some of my paternal relatives because of my HIV status. And, it was a series of events, and I couldn't contain the situation. I was just fed up with it, and I tried killing myself by taking all of the medication I had. And I texted one of the aunties at Africade, and they immediately took me to the hospital. And when I was discharged from the hospital, they gave me ongoing counseling, and that's when I told myself that I want to come out in the open and share my story and share the challenges that adolescents and young people continue to face.
Thank you so much for sharing it with us today as well, Lois. Much, much appreciated. You've been on a hell of a journey. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Tom Hayes is HIV positive and the editor-in-chief of Beyond Positive, which is an online lifestyle magazine for people living with HIV. Tom, good afternoon. Welcome to Afternoon Edition, my friend. Tom, are you with us? It doesn't seem that Tom is with us. Let us go back to...
there
he is with us.
Hello.
There we go. Tom, thank you very much indeed. Hello. We can speak to someone in Zimbabwe, but we can't speak to Tom. The irony of that. Tom, thank you for joining us. Now, tell us about some of the stigma that you yourself have experienced.
Yes, I've been living with HIV since 2011, so that's 5 years now. I think it's slowly getting better, but I've had my fair share of poor experiences. shortly after I was diagnosed, I went to go and see my GP in a small village in Worcestershire. And when I went in, all of our files were stacked on the reception desk. Mine was on the top, and it had HIV scrawled across the front of the folder in big red marker pen, which was out in the open for everyone in the village to see who popped into the GP surgery. So, as you can imagine, that made me feel like, I was a leper, like the Black Death put a red cross on your front door.
Yeah, what did you say?
At the time, I didn't actually say anything. I was so upset. I'd only been diagnosed for maybe a month or two at that point. But it wasn't until I went and spoke to some of my friends I'd met who were living with HIV that I made a complaint to the primary care trust, who went in and made sure everyone had appropriate HIV training.
Tom, can I ask you why you think it is that we're still living with a stigma around AIDS, and what can be done to fix that, given how far we've come in medical treatment?
Yeah, you say we've come so far in 30 years medical treatment. We've moved faster than any other disease in the entire world. But the problem is education. As people have mentioned today, the Tombstone advert, that was the last general public information campaign on HIV in the UK, and that was 27 years ago this year. 27 years since there was a public information campaign on HIV. And
that one was utterly terrifying.
It was terrifying. It served a purpose, and it did good at the time, but it's got somewhat of a toxic legacy.
You're absolutely right.
There's targeted advertising towards gay men and the African community, which is great. Those are communities most at risk. But the general public, the people that I interact with every day, doctors, nurses, employers, they don't know anything. They're not being targeted by these specific campaigns. There needs to be something bigger, something more general. If we can have it for asthma and healthy eating and obesity and smoking and drinking, can we not have one for HIV?
Tom, thank you so much for being part of the discussion today. Much, much appreciated. And also Andy Evans, who lives with HIV as well and is haemophiliac. Andy, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Valerie Delpeche, excuse me, Valerie, I'll get it right eventually. Delpeche, lead for HIV Surveillance and Public Health England. Deborah Gold, Chief Executive of the National AIDS Trust. And Anne Aslett, thank you very much indeed, Anne, Executive Director of the Elton John AIDS Foundation.